I scoff at this rumor.
Now, we must explain something.
I scoff. When I'm scoff.
He stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped. The studio audience could see it happening in real time. America's coolest, sharpest, most unshakable host, completely losing his train of thought, staring across the desk at a woman who hadn't even said a word yet. For 3 or 4 seconds, on live national television, Johnny Carson simply forgot he was performing.
Really should
Just a
have.
time.
I thought maybe at the cemetery you would have that day.
Yeah.
Just get in.
These are 6 of the women who walked out from behind that curtain and, for a few unforgettable minutes, took the most controlled man in television completely off script, the guests whose presence on The Tonight Show left even Johnny Carson stumbling over his own questions.
Yes. You met Davy Crockett, haven't you?
Yo, that's
Most people remember Carson as untouchable. 30 years behind that desk, more than 4,500 broadcasts, over 25,000 guests interviewed, and a reputation as the one host who never lost his footing no matter who sat across from him.
good at night in the darkness, and I took my jeans down, and they had a little wood thing, you know.
What almost nobody talks about is how often that footing actually disappeared, and that the man famous for his icy, unreadable cool was, according to nearly everyone who worked closely with him, genuinely shy underneath it. Off camera, around certain women he found captivating, Carson reportedly bore almost no resemblance to the confident host America watched every night at 11:30.
They had a big cocktail party last night for,
Tonight, we're going back through the nights that cracked that armor, the compliments that came out clumsy, the questions that trailed off into nothing, the laughter that lingered a beat too long, and what those moments reveal about the real man who sat behind that desk for 3 decades. Here's Johnny and all.
Better be stupid, God.
please, oh.
This isn't the story of one single guest or one single night. It's a pattern that built up slowly across 30 years, 6 different women, 6 completely different kinds of chemistry, and one host who, more often than the legend suggests, found himself genuinely caught off guard by the people sitting across from him. But before we get to the women themselves, it helps to understand something most viewers never knew while they were watching, the contradiction underneath the whole act.
He's a great guy.
And he was so wonderful, and I said, well, you're right.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson played the single most confident man on American television. He opened every broadcast with a monologue in front of a live studio audience, fielded hecklers, recovered from dead silent jokes without flinching, and somehow made it look effortless, night after night, for 4,500 episodes.
Welcome back, folks. I'm just sitting here.
To the country, he was the definition of cool under pressure. Off camera, colleagues described someone almost unrecognizable. Carson was, by nearly every account from people who worked with him for years, a genuinely private and socially uneasy man, someone who preferred a quiet dinner with a handful of trusted friends like Don Rickles or Bob Newhart over any kind of crowded room. He didn't work a party. He didn't linger after tapings making small talk.
This picture cannot be a Disney film, you know what I mean? If the two of us stand up in a scene.
The performer disappeared the moment the cameras stopped rolling, and what was left was someone notably more reserved than the character audiences had just spent 90 minutes watching. That contrast is exactly what makes the guests on this list so interesting. A naturally outgoing host being charmed by a beautiful guest would barely register as a story, that's simply the job.
On January 3rd, it's going to be 11 a.m. on the West Coast and 12.
But a host who was, by his own staff's repeated description, shy and guarded around people in general, becoming visibly flustered, visibly delighted, visibly off his rhythm around a specific handful of women? That's not just charm working as intended. That's the rare moment when the real Carson and the performed Carson briefly became the same person.
I think you should know.
Former staffers who spent years around the show have pointed to this exact tension again and again, the gap between the smooth, unbothered desk persona and the considerably more careful, more private man who existed the second the lights went down. It's why certain interviews stand out so sharply from thousands of others. They weren't just good television. They were glimpses of someone the audience almost never got to see.
It's been freezing, and you don't realize the number of things you do electric.
And once you know that detail about him, the genuine shyness hiding underneath 30 years of polish, every single moment in this list reads completely differently. With that in mind, let's start with the guest almost every Tonight Show staffer points to first when this subject comes up, the woman Johnny Carson invited back again and again, long after most actresses had worn out their welcome.
In Manhattan, I never saw a cow till I was 20.
Yeah, but we used to go out.
Throughout the 1960s and deep into the 1970s, one name kept reappearing on Johnny Carson's guest list with a frequency that set her apart from almost everyone else in Hollywood: Angie Dickinson. By the time she first sat down across from him, Dickinson was already one of the most recognizable leading ladies in the country, a former co-star of John Wayne's in Rio Bravo who would go on to headline Policewoman and become one of network television's first female action stars. She had nothing to prove and no reason to play nervous for anyone, and according to people who worked behind the cameras, that self-assurance was exactly why Carson loved having her there.
If these are a regular deck of cards. They are a regular deck of cards.
Most guests arrived with an agenda, a movie to promote, a story rehearsed and repeated for the 10th time that month on a press tour. Dickinson arrived like she was dropping by a friend's living room instead. She teased him on air.
We got in this. Put him aside over there. What do you want to
play?
She let silences stretch a little too long, almost daring him to fill the gap. And where other guests tightened Carson up, pushing him to retreat behind a scripted joke, Dickinson seemed to do the exact opposite. She loosened him. That's when the shift would happen, almost every single time she appeared. The rapid-fire desk jockey persona would soften. The delivery would slow down. Carson would lean forward instead of settling back into the chair, and the studio audience could see it plainly. A host who, for a few minutes, wasn't performing the role anymore, he was simply enjoying the conversation.
Really should
Just a
have.
time.
I thought maybe at the cemetery you would have that day.
Yeah.
Just get in.
Producers and longtime crew members who worked the show across that era repeatedly described her as one of the easiest, most natural pairings the program ever had, a guest who could put Carson at ease faster than almost anyone else in Hollywood.
A whole course on that is taught in the home.
There was no friction, no competing for the punchline, just an easy rhythm that made the whole broadcast feel effortless instead of engineered. Where most actresses got one or two especially memorable appearances scattered across Carson's 30 years, Dickinson kept getting invited back, decade after decade, far longer than the usual promotional cycle would ever justify. That kind of repetition wasn't an accident on a show that famously controlled every detail of its guest list down to the minute. It was a pattern, and everyone backstage seemed to notice it. That is precisely why, decades later, clips of Dickinson's Tonight Show appearances still circulate among classic television fans as some of the loosest, warmest interviews Carson ever gave on the air, proof that even the most disciplined performer in television history had at least one guest who could make him forget the format entirely, night after night, year after year, for the better part of 2 decades. But if Dickinson showed how comfortable Carson could become, the next woman on this list did something almost nobody else ever managed. She made him lose the thread completely, on camera, in front of millions. By the early 1970s, Raquel Welch wasn't simply a movie star. She was, by most measures of the era, the most photographed woman alive, a global sex symbol whose iconic poster had outsold nearly everything else on the market that decade, and a guest who carried an entire room's attention before she'd even finished crossing the stage to her chair. Carson had, by that point, interviewed thousands of beautiful, famous women without incident. He had a system that worked almost automatically, a couple of warm-up jokes, a compliment delivered with just enough irony to keep it from sounding sincere, then a clean pivot into questions about whatever film she was there to promote. It worked, reliably, on nearly everyone. It did not work, reliably, on Welch. Multiple documented Tonight Show appearances captured the same strange pattern playing out. Carson would begin a thought, offer a compliment, and then visibly struggle to pivot back into an actual question. He would pause. He would glance down at his note cards a beat too long. The transition that usually took him half a second on instinct would stretch out, awkward and unmistakable, while the studio audience laughed openly at watching the unflappable host fumble for his footing. And that's when it would happen, the exact moment that made these particular interviews so quotable for decades afterward. Carson, mid-sentence, would simply lose the thread entirely, shake his head slightly as though physically resetting himself, and all but admit, in one way or another, that he had genuinely forgotten what he was about to ask. For a host who built 30 years of television on smooth, instant recovery from absolutely anything, that kind of unscripted stumble was rare. Around Welch, according to footage from several different appearances, it happened more than once. What happened next became one of the more talked about quirks of his entire run. The studio audience ate it up every time it occurred. Far from making Carson look unprofessional, those flustered moments became some of the most replayed exchanges of the era, precisely because they showed viewers something they almost never got to see otherwise: the single most composed man in American television, genuinely, visibly thrown off his own game. Decades later, those clips are still circulated by classic television fans specifically because of that contrast between Carson's reputation for total command of the room and the very real, very human moments when Raquel Welch walked out from behind the curtain and that command simply evaporated for a minute or two. Where Welch left him fumbling for words, the next guest on this list went a different direction entirely. She didn't fluster Carson with mystery or beauty alone. She did it with pure, unrelenting energy. By the mid-1960s, Ann-Margret had already established herself as one of the most kinetic performers working in show business, a Bye Bye Birdie and Viva Las Vegas star whose dancing alone could fill a room with energy before she'd said a single word to anyone. That same energy followed her straight onto Carson's set, episode after episode. She wasn't a guest who waited politely for the right question before coming alive. She arrived already mid-story before she had even finished sitting down, laughing before the joke had fully landed, pulling Carson into her rhythm instead of patiently waiting for him to set the pace the way most guests did. And that's when Carson, usually the one steering every single conversation on his own show with total control, would visibly give up trying to lead it. He'd let her talk straight through a planned transition. He'd let a bit run a beat longer than the format usually allowed. He'd laugh at things that weren't, strictly speaking, jokes, because cutting her off would have meant cutting off something that was simply, infectiously good television. Crew members who worked the show across that era often pointed to her appearances as some of the liveliest tapings of any given month, the kind where the studio audience needed almost no warm-up at all because Ann-Margret had already done that work for them before Carson had even asked his first scripted question. What made it work wasn't flirtation in the conventional sense most people assume. It was contagious enthusiasm, full stop. Where other guests needed Carson to actively draw the energy out of them across the course of an interview, Ann-Margret simply brought her own and handed it straight to the room the moment she walked in. Carson, for once, didn't have to manufacture the chemistry. He just got to enjoy it. Those tapings are remembered today less for any single quotable exchange and more for the overall feeling they left behind on tape, proof that Carson's chemistry with certain guests wasn't always rooted in nerves or careful compliments. Sometimes it was simply about a guest who refused, on principle, to let the room sit still around her. But if Ann-Margret showed Carson what it felt like to lose control of the pace entirely, the next guest on this list did something even rarer. She turned his own game back around on him, in front of his own audience. Most guests who walked into Carson's flirtatious banter played defense. They blushed. They laughed it off politely. They redirected, gratefully, to the safety of promoting whatever project had actually brought them onto the show that night. Suzanne Pleshette did the opposite, almost without exception. She played offense. Pleshette, the sharp-witted star of the Bob Newhart Show and a frequent Tonight Show guest across multiple decades, had a delivery built specifically for this kind of sparring: fast, dry, and completely unbothered by Carson's reputation for getting the last word on his own broadcast. Where other guests treated him as the authority figure sitting behind the desk, Pleshette treated him as an equal she fully intended to outmaneuver before the segment was over. The same pattern repeated almost every time she appeared on the show. Carson would open with a teasing line, expecting the usual playful retreat that nearly every other guest offered him by reflex. Instead, Pleshette would match it instantly, then raise it, throwing the joke back at him with enough edge that the audience would erupt before Carson had even managed to set up his follow-up line. What happened next became one of the most consistently entertaining dynamics of any recurring guest across the show's 30-year run. Carson, who had built his entire career on having the quickest comeback in any room, would find himself genuinely one step behind in real time, not flustered exactly, in the way Welch left him, but visibly working to keep pace, which for a man with his reflexes was its own kind of rare television. Longtime viewers and Tonight Show historians have pointed to Pleshette's appearances specifically because they flipped the usual script entirely. She wasn't dazzled by Carson the way a younger or less established guest might be. She wasn't nervous around him in the slightest. She was, plainly, often funnier than the moment strictly called for, and Carson, to his credit, seemed to genuinely love every second of getting beaten at his own game on his own show. That dynamic is exactly why those exchanges still hold up so well decades later, not as a story about a host charmed by a guest's looks, but as proof that the rare handful of people who could truly match Carson's wit, blow for blow, became some of his most memorable television partners of all. It's a different kind of chemistry than Dickinson's warmth or Welch's mystery, but it's chemistry all the same, the kind built entirely on respect. Not every name on this list, though, fits neatly into the warm, easy chemistry category these 4 segments have described so far. One of them complicates the entire story and shows exactly how high the stakes really were whenever Carson let someone get genuinely close. For nearly 2 decades, Joan Rivers wasn't just another guest passing through Carson's couch on a press tour. She was, for a long and significant stretch, his protégé, a comic he personally championed early in her career, brought back constantly once she found her footing, and eventually trusted enough to install as his permanent guest host, the closest thing to an heir apparent the Tonight Show desk had ever had in 30 years. That kind of trust, on a show as tightly controlled as Carson's, was almost unheard of for anyone, let alone a single guest. He was famously, almost ruthlessly selective about who he allowed near that chair, and several well-known names found themselves effectively frozen out of his orbit after crossing some line only Carson himself seemed to fully understand. Rivers, for years, was the clear exception to all of it. She had earned a closeness with him that almost no other guest, male or female, in 25,000 interviews ever managed to achieve. And that's when everything changed, abruptly and permanently. In 1986, Rivers accepted an offer to host a competing late-night program of her own without telling Carson first, before the news became public. To him, by every account since, it wasn't simply a career move made by an ambitious comic looking out for herself. It was a personal betrayal from someone he had spent years personally elevating, someone he had trusted with his own chair on the nights he wasn't there himself. Carson never confronted her publicly with some dramatic, televised blow-up the way a lesser host might have. That was never his style. He simply, completely, quietly removed her from his life. No more invitations. No public reconciliation, then or ever. The relationship that had taken nearly 2 decades to build ended in what amounted to total silence, and as far as the public record shows, it stayed that way for the rest of his life. The fallout reshaped how the entire industry understood Carson's inner circle from that point forward. If even Joan Rivers, his protégé, his hand-picked guest host, arguably the closest professional relationship of his entire career, could be cut off permanently over a single decision made without his knowledge, then everyone else watching understood exactly how real, and how final, Carson's lines could actually be when crossed. It's a difficult story to place next to Dickinson's easy chemistry or Plechette's playful sparring, and it doesn't fit the warmer pattern of the rest of this list. But it belongs here anyway, because it proves something important about every other woman we've covered so far. The warmth Carson showed Angie Dickinson, the fluster Raquel Welch caused without even trying, the energy Ann-Margret refused to let him control, none of that was guaranteed, ever, for anyone. It was rare specifically because Carson controlled access to himself so tightly, on camera and off. Rivers' story is the clearest proof of exactly what happened when that access was withdrawn for good. And that brings us to the final entry on this list, not a flirtation, and not a feud, but the single most emotional moment Johnny Carson ever shared with any guest, male or female, across 30 entire years behind that desk. On May 21, 1992, Johnny Carson sat down for what would become his final regular taping in front of a full studio audience. After 30 years and more than 4,500 broadcasts, the king of late night was now exactly one show away from walking off that stage for good. His guests that night were Robin Williams and Bette Midler, and it was Midler who would go on to deliver the single moment nobody who watched it has ever fully forgotten. Midler had been a Tonight Show regular for 2 full decades by that point, with appearances dating back to the early 1970s, and over those years she and Carson had built a genuine, easy friendship that went well beyond the usual host and guest formality. So when the conversation that night drifted somewhere more personal than usual, almost nobody sitting in that studio expected what was about to happen next. Carson mentioned, almost in passing, that Here's That Rainy Day was one of his all-time favorite songs. Midler simply began singing it right there at the desk, with no preparation and no introduction, and somewhere in the middle of the verse, she got Carson himself to join in, his voice noticeably cracking over the line about a worn-out wish thrown away. That's when the second, far bigger moment landed, the one that has been replayed countless times in the more than 3 decades since. As the broadcast neared its close, Midler stood up and sang One for My Baby, a torch song built entirely around the end of something irreplaceable, written for precisely this kind of goodbye. A camera operator that night, sensing exactly what was unfolding in real time, used an angle the show had reportedly never used before, capturing Carson's face as he watched her sing visibly, unmistakably emotional, live, on national television, with no way to cut away from it. When the song ended, Midler crossed the stage, draped a large red lei around Carson's neck, a quiet nod to her own Hawaiian roots, and pulled him into a hug. She was so overwhelmed in that moment that she had to run off the set entirely to cry, barely holding herself together long enough to make it past the curtain and out of camera range. The studio audience had already given him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 full minutes the moment he first walked out that night, and by the time Midler's performance finally ended, there wasn't a dry eye left anywhere in the building. It remains, to this day, one of the single most replayed and most emotional moments in the entire history of American late-night television, the night the most private, most guarded man on television let the whole country watch him feel something completely unguarded, for once, without a script to hide behind. It is no exaggeration at all to say that out of every guest across 30 years and 25,000 interviews, it was Bette Midler who got closest to the real Johnny Carson, in front of the single largest audience he ever had in his entire career. Robin Williams shared the stage that night too, but it was Midler's moment with Carson that the cameras, and history, ended up remembering most. Across 30 years, more than 4,500 broadcasts, and roughly 25,000 guests interviewed, Johnny Carson built a reputation as the single most controlled performer American television had ever produced, a man who could land a joke, recover instantly from a flop, and steer an entire live broadcast with a precision nobody before or since has fully matched. At his peak, close to 17 million people tuned in to watch him do it every single night, and the format he built, monologue, desk jokes, interview, music, is still the blueprint every late-night host since, from Letterman to Fallon, has borrowed from in one form or another. And yet, the moments people still talk about, decades after he left that desk for good, aren't the polished ones. They're the nights Angie Dickinson made him genuinely relax for once. The interviews where Raquel Welch left him visibly fumbling through his own note cards. The energy Ann-Margret simply refused to let him control. The sparring match Suzanne Pleshette quietly won more than once. The total, permanent silence that followed Joan Rivers' betrayal. And the one song, sung by an old friend, that finally cracked him wide open in front of the entire country. Carson spent 30 years being the most unreadable man on American television, and it turns out the moments that revealed who he actually was had almost nothing to do with the jokes he told so well for so long. They had everything to do with the small handful of women who, for just a few minutes at a time, made him forget to perform at all. No cue card, no rehearsal, and no 30 years of practice timing could have manufactured what happened in any of those moments. They happened, simply and only, because every now and then, even Johnny Carson stopped being "Here's Johnny" and became, for just a minute, a man who genuinely couldn't take his eyes off her. That, in the end, might be the most honest thing 30 years of television ever showed us about him.